I have a son with him. Before I start, I like to point out that English is not my first language, so please forgive me for any grammar mistakes or typos that I might make. This all started about 4 years ago. I was 22 at the time and was hopping from job to job while doing the same with guys. I wasn't happy with my life, nor was I happy with myself, but I guess we all have those periods of times in our lives, and I knew it was going to blow over sooner or later for me. Because of how bored I was with my life, I started seeing guys that were far older than me and honestly weren't good for me at all, and I was miserable at times, but I couldn't leave because I didn't know who I was if I was just up and left that life. Until I met the man who would eventually turn my life upside down, both in the best way possible and in the worst. We met through mutual friends. We'll call him Andrew. He was an American who lived in my country for the past 10 years, so while he preferred to communicate in English, we could communicate in my language as well. Also, because of the events that unfolded, I prefer not to mention my actual country, so bear with me, please. We hit it off immediately. Honestly, there was a spark there that I'd never had with anyone else, and it was the one thing that made me leave behind the honestly terrible life I'd led. He gave me the most motivation to go after a job I really wanted, one I finally stuck with, and I forgot all about those guys that treated me like nothing more than something for them to enjoy when they wanted. Life was finally looking up. Andrew was charming, he was helpful, and he was outgoing, always making small talk with people that he met, whether they were strangers or people that he knew, and he always turned a frown upside down wherever we went. He was perfect. I honestly thought he was, despite the fact that he was 20 years my senior. Either way, we fell in love, and soon moved in together. I had finally matured. My parents were proud of him, and I was genuinely happy. Though Andrew's temper was not one to play with, he often gets angry when things didn't go his way, and he was incredibly impatient, something I figured wasn't a lot to deal with when everything that was positive about him outweighed his negative side about 100 times. There were times when he'd throw a sandwich after me when he got mad, or times where he pushed me against the wall to get me out of the way. Looking back, I realized there were signs, but at the time, I'd been with much worse and I was just happy. My happiness completely blinded me. This was the man I wanted to spend the rest of my life with, and I'd happily look past his anger because everything else was far better than anything I'd ever had in my life, and everyone around me was happy for my sake. Honestly, because he fit so well in my family and my friends. He helped them out with whatever they needed help with, and he was a true gentleman. Something I realized later on was only a game he was playing. 3 years in, happy as can be, engaged and in a relationship everyone around me was rooting for, I found out I was pregnant. I wish I could say I was terrified, because it wasn't something we had planned, but the joy I felt was incredible. The 9 months leading up to my son's birth were like paradise. Andrew wasn't angry, not once. I was practically glowing, and everyone around me was so excited for the birth of my firstborn. However, after the birth of my son, I'd say about 2 months after, his temper started acting up again, and he'd get angry at me for the most ridiculous things, like if I let my son fall asleep on my rather than putting him in this crib while napping, or if I let someone else change his diaper while I watched, or if I wanted to make dinner while he looked after our son. His anger wasn't like before either. It was slowly but surely escalating, and I was so tired, completely exhausted, and focused only on my son, that I was zoning out whenever Andrew started getting angry. It wasn't until a few months later that I got to be too much, and I realized I'd had enough. My number one priority at the time was my son, and still is, obviously, and I couldn't be around a man that was angry at me no matter what I did, so yeah, I broke things off. I broke up with a man I had thought I was the love of my life, but in the end felt like nothing more than someone who I couldn't wait to have out of my life. Safe to say he wasn't happy. We were living together while I was waiting for him to find a place of his own, though we were sleeping in different rooms, and he was angry all the time, and I mean angry. He yelled every single day or night, and got up in my face several times, so much so that I thought he punched the daylights out of me a few times. He told me I was keeping his son from him, when in reality, I was trying to give them as much time as possible under the circumstances, but obviously, everything was my fault. Several times he was yelling so loud that the neighbors called the police on him. One time 3 police cars showed up, only for them to walk in on him completely peaceful and like a ray of sunshine. He was playing a game. He was playing it well for everyone on the outside. For me, it was a living hell. And everyone I told just said they couldn't believe it was as bad as it sounded. But he was a gentleman, and he was charming and always helpful. Like I said, this was all a game on his part, to keep everyone on his side if things were to go to absolute shit, like they did. Naturally, at the time, the police couldn't do anything because they didn't see a crime, nor did they see an abuser. It was my word against his. And things were like that up until my son's first birthday, when I promised Andrew that he'd get to have him for half of the day, while I got the other half to celebrate with him. I had said I was going to leave them alone, because this was his time with his son, and I didn't want to be in the way, mostly because I knew he wasn't going to do anything to my son. But as I was ready to leave, he told me to sit down so we could talk about things. I didn't want to start another fight, so I sat down. My son was on the floor playing with his toys, and as we talked, I noticed Andrew was getting more and more frustrated. I was figured because I wasn't giving him the answers he wanted, and I told him I had enough, and I was going to leave them alone until I came to pick up my son at 4 p.m. Andrew would have none of this. As I stood, he forcefully grabbed my wrist and pulled me back down on the couch before he proceeded to straddle me. He was much taller and bigger than me, and his mere weight on me was stressing me out. He told me I wasn't giving him a choice, as his hands wrapped around my throat, pressing hard, so much so that I couldn't breathe, and he continued telling me that he had no choice but to kill me, because I wasn't giving him what he wanted. My son, who had been witnessing all this time, started screaming his poor heart out, which caught Andrew off guard for a minute, which gave me enough time to sort of wriggle out of his tight grip, all the while apologizing for what I did, for what I said, anything to get him to loosen his grip enough for me to get out of there. He told me he'd be calling the police on me, and I tell him I was sorry for all the things I did, and I agreed, only for him to let go of me. As soon as he did, as he grabbed his phone to call the police, I made a run for the door. My throat was hurting, I was out of breath, and I left my son in there, because my only thought was to get myself to safety, once again because I knew he never hurt our son. I ran to the neighbors, knocked on the door frantically until they opened, and I broke down completely. When they opened the door, I told them everything that happened, and I told them to call the police. And once my neighbors had the dispatcher on the phone, I ran back to the house. I pulled the door open. My son was standing on the floor, screaming, and I grabbed him, all the while Andrew was on the phone with the police, telling them he'd had to forcefully get me to calm down. I wasn't waiting around. I quickly walked back to the neighbors with my son in my arms as I heard Andrew call after me how he'd made my life a living hell if I called the police. At that point, I didn't care. The police came after about 20 minutes along with an ambulance. I told everything that happened to them, and they documented the bruises on my wrist, as well as around my neck, before the paramedics made sure I was okay. I was, thankfully, and Andrew was still in the house when they arrested him. I was watching them in the window of my neighbor's house, and he was as calm as can be. When they walked him to the police car, it was absolutely eerie. They held him for 72 hours before they released him as a suspect, and I stayed with my friend while he stayed in the house. Honestly, I couldn't go back there, and I wasn't going to put my son through the stress of seeing his father in the same place where he'd witnessed everything that went down. Though after a week, he sent me a text saying he was gone, and with police escort, like my lawyer had told me was the best option. I went back to the house only to find him gone. The real kicker? I couldn't find my son's passport anywhere, not where I placed it, and I turned that house upside down, so I'm certain he took my son's passport with him, and I don't want to think about why. During the weeks after, I found out that he had 3 other children, all teenagers at this point, and all with 3 different women. He hadn't told me this before, and it was only when I was applying for a restraining order that I found out about it. My friends told me to contact the woman to see if he'd had a history of violence or if they'd gone through the same thing, and honestly, to no one's surprise at that point, he'd been arrested for domestic violence and attempted murder 2 times, and had been on probation once and sentenced to 10 months in prison another time. The women were happy to talk to me, to tell me everything, because they thought I deserved to know the truth. And I know I deserve to, because Andrew is the father of my child, and he tried to kill me. But he didn't only try to kill me, but 2 other women with whom he had children with as well. It's been a few months now. I don't know where he is, and my lawyer told me a trial isn't likely to happen for another couple of months, if not years, because they have other cases to prioritize. And that restraining order I applied for? Denied. So, now I live in absolute fear in the same house I was nearly murdered in with my friend, who so kindly moved in with me as support. I double-check that the door is locked several times a day. I have knives hidden all around the house in high places, where my son can't reach, and I can barely sleep at night. He sends me texts every now and then, telling me to apologize for what I did to him, and that I ruined his life, and will ruin my own if I don't apologize. I truly believe he genuinely thinks he's in the wrong here, and that's what the other women told me as well. So Andrew, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, unless it's at a trial to see you convicted for attempted murder and threats, let's not meet again. Dad's a sociopath, probably. So I heard about this subreddit when watching YouTube videos about true creepy stories. I thought I'd share mine, and I apologize if this is long-winded. I've read the rules, and I hope it doesn't break any of them. I guess I'll find out if it does anyways. My father is not a good person, and very likely a sociopath. He once threw a heavy object at his younger sister's head. I'll refer to her as my aunt from Harryon. He exclaimed it was an accident, but my aunt knew it was on purpose. He got into drugs in his teens and remains a drug addict to this day. I don't remember much of him from my early childhood, but what I do remember isn't very good. Pulling up the skirt of my dress to expose my underwear when I was 4 for no other reason than to humiliate me. Family members telling me I loved skirts and dresses when I was very little, but most of my childhood I can only recall hating them. I have to wonder if that had something to do with it. Other memories include he and my mother yelling at each other until she locked herself in the bathroom, and me putting my pet gerbil on his shoulder only for him to snap at me until I cried. But in order to fully understand the unsettling nature of this story, I have to go back to things I can't remember, or at least not in any kind of detail. I only know what my other family members have told me. My mom was 17, and my dad was 24 when they hooked up. To be fair, although my mom shouldn't have been allowed to do this kind of work she was doing at that age, she barely knew English, having moved from Quebec to Ontario, and I think her employers never bothered to make sure she was of age. Not that it would have been legal for my father to have a relationship with her even if he knew her age, but as the age of consent in Canada is only 14 back then, it's still only 16 now. Anyways, my father, selfish person that he was, refused to wear condoms, and my mom had been told by doctors that she couldn't have children. It didn't take long before it happened, and for about the first year of life, things were okay. It wasn't until in my late teens that I learned my mother had become pregnant again shortly after my birth and had an abortion. It wasn't until my mid-20s that I learned my father hadn't cared what the doctor said about giving my mom some time to recover after my birth. My brother was born prematurely, a mere year and a half after me. When he was about 13 months, my Nana, paternal grandmother, got a call from my maternal grandmother in broken English. She told my Nana that my brother and I were alone in the apartment, and she didn't know how long it had been. My Nana drove 3 hours to our city, and was horrified by what she found. My brother was in nothing but a diaper, crawling around on the cold floor, and had a swollen gland in his neck that was ready to burst. I had a blank stare and was coloring my bare skin with crayon. When one of my other aunts relayed this to me, she wanted to understand that it actually hurts to color on bare skin with crayon. Apparently that's how gone I was. I'm not going to go into all the details of my brother's and my recovery in our Nana's care, but my brother didn't know how to be held, and I was 2.5 and not talking. I would, however, scream at the top of my lungs whenever a strange man would enter a room I was in. My aunt says they were the worst screams she's ever heard. I was put into art therapy and drew pictures of houses with no windows in black crayon, and people with disproportionately large hands. Later drawings featured various characters in chains, ropes, gags, and blindfolds. My brother, meanwhile, had night terrors for a while. Like I said, I don't remember whatever it was that traumatized me so badly as an infant, but sometimes I wake up late at night, feeling very afraid for no discernible reason, and I retain a fear of large male hands until my mid-20s. I also have scars on both my inner thighs, no memory at all of where those came from. One looks like a scratch, and the other a clear cut. Fast forward to my teenage years. My brother and I had left our mother to live with our Nana again, and our father, our Nana's son, had claimed to be off the drugs and came back into our lives. It was a mistake for any of us to believe he could be a better person. He took advantage of my Nana, who was a cancer patient, and he and I used to clash a lot. He'd get my brother to search my room for any money I'd saved up when I was out of the house. When I later found out, I was livid, and he promised to pay me back, but he never did. He would show my brother and his friends really age-inappropriate things, and get pissed when any other family member put a stop to it. I remember he and I were in the living room, and had once had a pretty good conversation, which happened sometimes only because we were both intellectuals. Afterwards, he seemed to fall asleep, and I just started reading a book. I looked over at some point for whatever reason, and he was masturbating. His eyes were closed, and his pants were still on. I don't know if it was just like a habit he'd have while sleeping, or I'm not sure what. I don't want to fucking know. The house we lived in was fairly big, and my Nana often rented out some of the rooms. We'd grown fairly close to the couple renting one of them. My father was living in his own apartment by now, though he came around often. I was sick with the flu one night when my father got into a shouting match with a male renter. The girlfriend was crying, and I wanted her near me, both to offer comforts, and because I somehow felt safer with her near me when men were yelling at each other. Thankfully, they didn't get violent, but my father was going to leave and wanted to take me with him. I don't know why, but I got an overwhelming feeling of dread. I had visited him before, nothing had ever happened, but I never felt safe there, always on edge. I was sick and not very assertive at the best of times, so I was just going to go along with it even though my gut was screaming at me not to. Thankfully, the female renter put her foot down and said I was too sick to go, and I agreed. A few years later, my brother moved in with our father. Wasn't long until he came back, bringing their kitten with him. Traumatized, but still refusing to go into any of the details. But shortly after, I learned our father had attempted suicide, and my brother saw the blood in the sink. But none of my family think that was the worst of it, and many years later, he still won't talk about it. The whole family has cut my father off by now. He's tried to seek out my grandpa, but no one else. And now that my grandpa's moved and changed his number, my father has no way of accessing any of us. Now here's the thing. I'd assume when told about my early childhood that whatever had been done to me had been by my father's friends. I'd always known that my aunt, my father's sister, had experienced some kind of sexual abuse as a child, but never by whom. A year or so ago, my aunt revealed it was my father who'd done it. I also recall when my father told me about a time he'd raped a woman who had passed out. He made a big show of being against sexual assault, especially of children, but clearly did not walk the talk. He hadn't drawn the line at his own little sister, so it's not a stretch that he wouldn't stop at his kid either, given that and many other borderline inappropriate comments he's made to me, and everything I've detailed so far. I have to wonder if it wasn't just his friends who's done whatever to me as a baby, and given that overwhelming intuition I'd felt that it wasn't safe to spend the night at his place when I was sick and incapacitated, I have to wonder just what would have happened if I did. So, Dad, wherever you're lurking in the city, let's never fucking meet again. Deadeyed Baby Daddy. This just happened the other night. Friend told me y'all might like it. I live in an apartment complex on the edge of a bad neighborhood. Our immediate area is pretty good. We have a church across the streets, a retirement home next door, and a grade school on the other side of the street. The rest of the neighborhood for a couple blocks is normal middle-class homes. But sometimes the area to the north of us leaks. Our complex is gated, but it does fuck all really, because anybody who wants to get in just waits until a resident opens the gate. I mean, it's whatever. What can you do? Usually, I park in the guest spots just outside the gate, but still inside the lots, because I leave for work crazy early, and I've been parked in before. Then I can't figure out who did it because everyone is asleep. So I'm parking my car, get out, reach in my pocket to hit the opener, and I'm walking through the gate when out of nowhere, the silver SUV with dealer plates comes screaming into the gate, blasting gangsta rap, misses hitting me by about 6 inches, maybe less. I'm pissed and stunned and I yell out, "Bro, you almost hit me, look where you're going." He turns the music down and opens the window, says, "What you say?" and I repeat myself. He's a Hispanic man, probably in his early 20s, well-dressed, good-looking. He looks at me, completely calm and conversational, just as if he was saying, "Excuse me, can you tell me where the 7-Eleven is?" And says, "I don't care. Don't you understand that? Your life is nothing to me. If you got a man up there, I'll slap the shit out of you right in front of him. Believe that." His eyes look completely dead, just calm and cold. That's what scared me, not what he said. He parks his car in the lot, music still blasting. It sits there for about 10 minutes when I hear the neighbor downstairs yelling at him to turn it down. The guy comes out of the apartment he was in, gets into his car, K-turns in the parking lot, smashes his new ride into my neighbor's car, then peels out of the parking lot. The police come and talk to everyone. The apartment he visited is a couple, their child, and a roommate and her baby. The visitor is the father of the roommate's baby. The couple knew of him, but not who he was. The man answered the door and this dude just pushed his way in, making threats at his ex in the same calm manner. Then came out, rammed the neighbor's car and left, all without breaking a sweat or raising his voice. The roommate explains she was with him for about a year and he was sweet as could be. She got pregnant, he disappeared, and when she took him to court for child support, she found out he had 11 other children by 10 different women, counting her. That's some Hannibal Lecter shit right there. And if this guy hasn't already killed someone, I fully believe he could. He did, and said all this stuff so casually.